Well, good morning, everybody. I was reflecting this morning that I had the privilege of being here at this forum, I think from the very beginning. And of course, I think this is the sixth year that this forum has been held. And I remember the first forum. And I remember that we were talking about competitiveness, and we were talking about the Saudi Arabian economy, and we were reflecting on the opportunity, on the challenges. And I remember thinking at the time that this country was committed to working on this topic. And indeed, you have. Indeed, Saudi Arabia has now really a definite, unmistakable commitment to transforming the economy, to boosting competitiveness, and to really finding a way to drive long-term improvements in the standard of living of citizens here. And the journey that Saudi Arabia is on is a journey that other nations are on as well. Nations in the Gulf, nations in other parts of the world. And what I'd like to talk about today is really another chapter in the book of the journey of Saudi Arabia and other resource-rich countries to prosperity, to sustained prosperity, to prosperity that spreads to many citizens. That's the fundamental reason that we are all here. That's the reason why we're worrying about economic development. It's to create that opportunity for countries to flourish and diversify and create opportunity for all. It's a challenge that we in the United States have assumed that we've succeeded at. But as Dean Schlesinger just said, even America now is struggling with this issue of how to create prosperity widely in our society. As vital and as innovative as America is, this is a never-ending challenge. And it's a never-ending challenge for this country. What I'd like to do is focus specifically on the role of entrepreneurship, on the role of building businesses in the private sector. Every business starts small. Hopefully those small businesses grow. How is that important to competitiveness? Where does it fit? And where is this country and other countries like it in the journey of creating true entrepreneurship? I think it's generally recognized now that the only way to achieve really highly advanced country status is to create an environment and a track record of entrepreneurship. We'll talk about why. But it's very hard to do. It's very hard to do because it involves not just building roads or investing money. It involves changing the culture, changing the attitudes, changing the willingness of young people to take risk. And that's a very difficult change indeed. So let's talk about competitiveness. Let's talk about entrepreneurship. And then let's talk about this country's journey in trying to create this next big chapter of the book that is Saudi Arabia's economic history. Now, we are at a very, very interesting moment in the world economy right now, and you all know it better than I. Every day we hear about how fragile growth is, particularly in the advanced world. America, Europe, and even now China and some other emerging economies. What's causing this period of slow growth? Well, it's basically macroeconomic. Country after country has borrowed too much, spent too much, and doesn't have sound finances. And we are trying to adjust to that, and that is a very painful and difficult process. And it is holding down growth and making the recovery from this particular recession very, very slow. Because we all have to get our balance sheet in order. And to do that, growth almost inevitably slows down. I was watching one of those shows yesterday, and the new forecast of GDP growth has been revised down again. And the expectations in America are that next year the growth is going to be less than 3% again. We are in a very difficult slow growth period, really driven by macroeconomic financial problems. But ultimately, solving those financial problems are not going to solve the real problem. The real problem of economic and job growth in the world is not a problem of finance. It's fundamentally a problem of competitiveness. It's a problem of countries really driving their productivity and their capacity to be competitive. This is the only way that you can create sustainable jobs and growth in the long run. We can deal with this recession, but unless we deal with the issue of competitiveness, unless we allow countries to continue to get more productive, which will allow wages to grow and demand to increase, we will ultimately be in a slow growth mode for many, many years to come. So once again, we must turn to this issue of competitiveness. America is facing a fundamental challenge to competitiveness, one that we have not seen for more than 25 years, since Japan was rising. Europe is facing a fundamental challenge of competitiveness. Of all the efforts in Europe that have been taken over the last 5 or 10 years, the biggest failure has really been Lisbon. Efforts to really fundamentally change the environment competitiveness. Japan has continued to grow very, very slowly or even shrink because it's not been able to deal with the fundamental challenges it faces in terms of competitiveness. The only way to really make growth reignite in the global economy in the long run as we get through this financial readjustment will be to restart competitiveness and growth in competitiveness. So what do we know about competitiveness? Well, of course, we've been talking about competitiveness for many years now, and it's no longer a new subject. And it's certainly no longer a new subject here. But what I find is there's still a tremendous confusion about the word competitiveness. You know, some people think that you make yourself competitive by cutting the wages. But that only makes a country poor. That couldn't be success. Some people think that you make yourself competitive by bringing down the value of your currency. But we know that bringing down the value of your currency only makes the nation poorer, because you have to pay more for all the goods and services that you need to buy from abroad. And you sell your own goods cheaper. There's a lot of misunderstanding about competitiveness. And one of the things that we've been doing in our HBS, Harvard Business School project recently is trying to make sure that everybody understands what it means. Competitiveness fundamentally occurs when two things happen. You're competitive if your companies can compete in international markets while improving the standard of living for citizens. You have to be able to do both. If companies succeed by cutting jobs and cutting wages, you're not competitive. You're uncompetitive. If wages go up but companies can't succeed, you're not competitive, you're uncompetitive. We have to put these two things together. And the only way to do that is to be more productive. To get every day of work to generate more output, more valuable output. Because if a worker can generate more output in a day, better output, higher quality output, then wages and the standard of living can go up. This is the fundamental rule of competitiveness. It's all about being productive. It's all about creating the right business environment that stimulates efficiency and productivity and innovation and new ideas and new products and new skills. We know that. About this, there is no doubt. So all we have to do as collectively in any country, in America now or elsewhere, we have to get all of our efforts focused on creating that environment for productivity. And of course, entrepreneurship becomes a very crucial part of the overall story. Because if we can't get those new businesses creating new products and new services and meeting those needs in the economy, they're not being filled by larger companies or existing companies, then that process of productivity growth really doesn't happen. That's why entrepreneurship matters. It's not theoretical. It's very practical. It has to do with how we actually grow the vitality and the productivity of an economy. Now, in building competitiveness, we have come to understand that there is a sort of a strategy required. Every nation starts with some endowments, resources, people, a location in the world, access to the sea, things like that. Every nation starts with endowments. This country happens to have a very rich endowment in many ways, a poor endowment in some others, not much water, but a good endowment in many important ways. But that endowment alone only takes you so far. What makes you wealthy and prosperous and creates opportunity for all citizens is to use that endowment to produce a lot of valuable goods and services and meet a lot of the needs of citizens in that country and other countries with which it trades. In order to do that, you have to create a very stable macroeconomic platform. And when we use the word macroeconomic, we refer not only to macro policy, fiscal and monetary policy, where this country is actually quite strong, but we also refer to macro competitiveness in terms of social development and a sound political system. Because we've learned that unless you have healthy people, unless you have people that are educated, unless you've invested in developing those people's capabilities, you can't be productive. No matter how hard they work, they can't be productive. Unless you create the right kind of political institutions and governance so that government does its job well, it's very hard to be productive. One of the major learnings of the last 10 years of thinking about competitiveness is actually the role of social development in economic competitiveness. We used to think social development was a separate topic. Now we understand that social and political development is absolutely fundamental to creating a platform for a higher standard of living, and especially for spreading that standard of living more widely among citizens. But that's not enough. As we've talked many times here, in order to truly be competitive, you have to create a very strong microeconomic competitiveness. And that has to do with creating firms, companies that are very sophisticated, that are well managed, that use the right management and systems and processes. It comes from having a great business environment that makes it efficient to do business in that country or that location. And finally, it relates to building clusters, where you have not just one firm here and one firm there, but you have firms in particular fields where you develop a deep expertise in that field. Here in this country, you have it in petroleum, you have it in chemicals, where you have a critical mass of knowledge and expertise and talent to build a cluster. And those clusters have a profound influence on driving productivity. We now know that from the latest work that's been done, where we're finally able to very rigorously measure the impact of clusters on economic development. Now, the question is, how's this country and other countries like it doing in building this architecture of competitiveness? Where does entrepreneurship fit in? Why should we be so worried about entrepreneurship? Why should almost every ministry in the government here that's related to the economy have a program on entrepreneurship? Why do we need that? Well, let's talk about that. Competitiveness, as I said earlier, has become central to Saudi's economic policy agenda, and there's been a lot of progress. There's been substantial reforms. All of you have seen those. I've seen those. You know, even since this forum started, we've seen many, many areas of reform. There's many, many things I could comment on, but I won't, because you all know what those reforms have been. They've been in infrastructure. They've been in market opening. They've been in legal reform. and improving the judiciary system. There's been a major push on business regulation, trying to improve education, create new universities, improve the regulation and transparency and governance in the financial markets. There's been a whole plethora of reforms. You're all familiar, of course, with doing business rankings, and this was, of course, a major focus given the 10 by 10 program. Quite a remarkable amount of progress. Not perfect, everything isn't done, but a lot of progress. And we see that in many areas. In Saudi Arabia, there's been a lot of improvement in the law, a lot of improvement in the regulation, a lot of improvement in the policies, in a whole variety of areas of competitiveness. As this has happened, we've started to see a development of really private firms in this country that are not connected to government or the multinationals that operate here. They've been bubbling up. They've been bubbling up. And this is great. This is a critical part of economic development. It's a start. But I think what we all understand is that it's just a start. Because the country is still not performing well enough from an economic development point of view. It's doing okay. It's doing better. It's moving up. But the job is not done. And in particular, the job of job creation is not done. And all of us know that in this country, we have an awful lot of people that are going to need jobs. And despite the wealth of this country, there's not enough wealth to pay all those people. We need to actually create productive jobs. That's, in a way, the central economic challenge facing the country. But of course, to create productive jobs, you just can't create jobs. You have to create competitiveness and successful enterprises who create jobs. Government can hire more people or provide rules that require other people to hire more people, but unless there's really productive jobs being created by enterprises, you ultimately don't have enough money, even Saudi Arabia, to deal with this problem. So the question is, how do we do it? How do we do it? The economy of this country continues to be relatively narrow. Economic diversification has been a central priority for many, many years, for the obvious reason that the industries in green on this chart, which are where Saudi Arabia has a strong international market position, these industries don't employ that many people. We need to diversify the economy into a whole variety of other areas, both local and traded, which can proliferate opportunity for citizens, can create many more jobs outside of these traditional strengths. And the question is how to do that. The question is how to do that. Part of the answer has to do with the general business environment. Education, for example. We know that if we just get enough people well enough educated, that helps. But what we have learned over and over and over again from other countries, and I've had the opportunity to work in many of them, is that ultimately it's that process of creating new, smaller, and medium-sized companies that is indispensable in driving continued movement in competitiveness and income and growth. It's entrepreneurship. It's entrepreneurship. So the question is, why? What does entrepreneurship do in the process of economic development? What do we need to do to create it? And where do we stand in Saudi Arabia? So let's spend a moment on that. Let's spend a moment on that. Now, there's a sort of a symbiotic relationship between competitiveness and entrepreneurship. Competitiveness being the ability to be productive and to drive long-term productivity growth. Entrepreneurship the creation of small and medium-sized companies and the growth of those companies in the private sector really becomes an indispensable part of the competitiveness process. You see some of the key points on this slide. It isn't possible to start entrepreneurship until you reach a certain level of competitiveness. And Saudi Arabia has reached that level. You have to get your circumstances good enough, and that's when entrepreneurship starts, real entrepreneurship. But once you get it started, it then creates a feedback loop and pushes and pushes and pushes the competitiveness process itself. As these small and medium-sized companies create pressure and demand for continued improvements and upgrading, they expose weaknesses in the regulatory and policy environment. Entrepreneurship is critical to building clusters. Yes, we can have, Saudi Aramco, this gigantic company. But without these supporting firms, without the firms that perform the services and make the components and do the maintenance, a Saudi Aramco or an energy cluster can't be really productive. We need entrepreneurship to fill out the cluster and allow clusters to be dynamic and efficient. We need entrepreneurship to start sending out new efforts in new fields. This is how diversification takes place. It doesn't come top down. It comes bottom up. The entrepreneur sees an opportunity outside of one of the traditional fields that's well developed, starts a company, that leads to more companies, that leads to more companies. That's how economic diversification happens. Some happens by government policy. Most of it happens bottoms up. That's what we see around the world. The data is very clear that in most countries, it's small and medium-sized enterprise growth that creates the vast majority of the jobs. It's the really only solution. Government can't do it. Big companies, by and large, in the industries in which Saudi Arabia competes, don't create millions of jobs. They create tens of thousands of jobs. It's those small and medium-sized companies spreading all across the economy that are going to substitute for imports and create those large-scale jobs that this country actually needs. So the question then we have to ask ourselves is, how do we jumpstart entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia? And again, this is not a new topic. It's a topic that's been discussed a lot. But my perception, and I'm not one of you, my perception is that we understand that this is an important agenda item, but the country has not quite yet got a coherent strategy to do this. Lots of ministries and agencies are doing things, but they've not yet really coalesced and come together into a coherent overall plan. And so let's talk a little bit about that. What do we need to create the conditions for entrepreneurship? Well, like in everything that has to do with competitiveness, the answer is many things. Entrepreneurship isn't the result of one policy. It's the result of many policies sustained over time. This slide talks about some of the critical areas that we've learned from elsewhere in the world are important. We need some education and support to entrepreneurs in terms of building their businesses, how to do that, assistance and advice in that process. We need sort of entrepreneurial education. President Schlesinger from Babson College leads a college that is probably preeminent in this field. And we all should be extremely pleased that he and Babson is here, because that's a critical part of the environment for entrepreneurship that has to be created. It's not there's not a lot of talented young people in this country and other GCC countries. It's just that they have never been schooled in how to do this. And that's important. We need policies that make it easy to start businesses. And luckily, there's been some pretty good progress. ease of incorporating a business, ease of doing business in terms of navigating the regulatory environment and the laws, a good legal, commercial legal code. You want bankruptcy laws that are not too harsh. One of the reasons we have entrepreneurship in America is if you try to build a company and it fails, it's not the end of your life. In fact, it's kind of cool in America to have failed and start another company. But that takes a legal system that isn't too punishing of failure, that has a way of kind of resolving the debts as best as possible without meaning that somebody's entire life, is over from the point of view of business. So we need a good legal structure for entrepreneurship, and I think this country needs some modifications there. And we can talk about that later. You need funding. You need access to capital. A lot of entrepreneurial capital comes from friends and family, personal savings. But as companies want to grow, they are going to need access to debt. They're going to need access to equity capital in a variety of forms. As we'll see in a minute, Saudi Arabia is building some of those potentials, although it's still relatively weak. To have entrepreneurship, we need strong incentives to do it. Or we need to avoid disincentives to do it. And those are things like, of course, low taxes, which you have because you have no taxes. But it's also kind of psychic incentives. It's protecting intellectual property. It's protecting ideas. It's protecting trademarks so that an entrepreneur that builds a company can't get copied by a big company too quickly and too easily. They can protect their rights. They can get benefits from what they've created. We need purchasing to be open to small businesses. If you want to start small businesses, make sure that every government contract is open to small businesses, and that it's easy for small businesses to figure out where the contracts are and how to qualify and how to actually win the contract. In our country, we actually dedicate a certain percentage of all government purchasing to small business, because that's seen as good for driving economic vitality. Entrepreneurs need support services. They need legal services. They need business services that are part of the entrepreneurial success process. So those are some of the factors that entrepreneurs particularly need. None of those is surprising. Pretty much common sense. But putting them in place is not so easy. And again, in this country, it's work in process. We have a ways to go. Now, what's the opportunity for entrepreneurship here? Well, it's fantastic. If I were an entrepreneur, this would be a great place to do it at one level. We have a very stable economy. We have a lot of growth in terms of the population. There's lots of unmet needs, lots of markets that are not well served, lots of products and services that are waiting to be offered. Very good incentives, financial incentives. Government making steady investment in the economy, which is creating growth opportunities. Lots of foreign companies, coming here looking for help and services that could be provided by entrepreneurs. Some, improving financial capital availability, and of course, Saudi Arabia is a logical place to be an entrepreneur to serve not only this country but the region as a whole. All those things are good, and the experience we have in entrepreneurship in this country really validates that. Those people that have had the capacity, the talent, and the good fortune to build companies here, private companies. Many of them have done extraordinarily well, grown very, very rapidly. The average small startup growth company here is substantially bigger than it is in many other countries because of these positive circumstances. Who are the people building businesses in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries? Well, we learned a little bit about that from efforts like the Saudi Fast Growth 100, which I was very honored to be part of creating a few years back. There's a new ranking called the Arabia 500, which I have some ties with, because I think that all efforts to make transparent the growth of small entrepreneurial businesses is profoundly important in a country like this, to really stimulating young people to try it and creating prestige and recognition for the enormous impact that new businesses can have on this country. The typical entrepreneur in this region is well-trained, mostly in engineering and business. Almost all entrepreneurs, and this is true globally, worked somewhere else first. It's not like they were at Harvard University and they started Facebook. That's the exception. The rule is that you work somewhere, you learn a business, and then you see an opportunity, you see a gap, you see a need, and there you go. And that happens here. The best entrepreneurs that we see in this region are able to tailor products and services to local needs. They're not just copying the foreign companies, they're doing it differently. They're doing it with a local sensibility that a large multinational won't have. The best entrepreneurs, the ones that are succeeding here, are well educated enough that they are operating their companies using world-class processes. They're not primitive. They're using IT better in many ways than larger companies. They know how to think about the supply chain. They have good human resource management practices. They are running well. They have an international outlook. They have international connections. And there are many Saudis like this. There are many potential entrepreneurs sitting here in this room. And there's immense opportunities to build businesses here. It's like the Wild West in America. When our country was just growing, there was limitless opportunity to be entrepreneur in this sort of untapped environment. And that's certainly the case here. And these entrepreneurs are starting to do what entrepreneurs need to do for an economy. They are diversifying the economy. We're seeing a lot of movement into educational services, IT services, all kinds of new areas in the economy are starting to show some signs of growth. Very importantly, entrepreneurs in this country and in the region are a conduit by which Saudi nationals are actually moving into the private sector, which has been a very challenging economic policy goal for this country. But it's clear that a lot more needs to be done because this effort is still perhaps a trickle, not a flood. We've got wonderful examples now. We celebrate them, but we need more. And the question is, what do we do? Now, government has been doing its part to try to create a better environment. This slide illustrates some of the most policies, at least that I'm aware of, that have been pursued to try to incubate businesses, provide support to entrepreneurship, and you see that there's quite a few of them. And that's good. Although we have to be careful that we're not doing too much proliferation of too many different programs, rather than take the good programs and drive them to scale. And I'm a little bit worried about that. But I do want to highlight the challenges that still are being faced here and elsewhere in the Gulf and in other emerging economies that are trying to do the same thing. Because I have the same discussion in Peru, and the same discussion in Colombia, and the same discussion in Chile, and the same discussion in a variety of other countries. How can we get the small business entrepreneurship agenda really cooking? And there's some really complex obstacles that we have to overcome. Culture. Culture has to do with where prestige lies in the economy, where the path is that people tell their friends, oh, I'm doing this, and their friends say, oh, wow, I'm impressed. There's a cultural factor. And right now, the cultural factor has not evolved to the point where entrepreneurship is sort of a mainstream activity. It's still something that's unusual. It's still something that's a little scary. We're trying to change that with recognition programs, but that will take time. There's a lack of public visibility of emerging companies, of entrepreneurship. We're trying to change that, but this will take some time. There is a real problem of risk aversion and fear of failure for obvious reasons, given the history, given the tradition, norms in this region. There's a caution, conservatism. And you know, when you can make very high profitability just doing real estate, why start a business? If it's easy to make a pretty good return, you know, without being an entrepreneur, then why do it? And I think that's a very real challenge facing this country and many others like it. We're going to have to deal with that. There's still limited skills in the workforce. So who do these companies hire? And how can they compete with the government? How can they compete with government-linked companies? How can they compete with multinationals that offer these giant training programs that are willing to do almost anything to get Saudi workers? And the salaries keep getting bid up. So how can the smaller businesses actually make it work? Government regulation has gotten a lot better, but it's still quite challenging for a relatively small company that doesn't have a department of government regulation, where there's somebody that spends every day just figuring out, how to get things done, which is still a problem. So how do we address that? Limited focus still in this country on cluster development. Clusters become a very powerful vehicle for driving entrepreneurship, particularly if the clusters are organized. If they're organizations that provide training and education and support and networking opportunities within chemicals, within IT services, within food, within other parts of the economy. These clusters then become a natural vehicle for spinning out companies. But cluster development, although it's talked about a lot in Saudi Arabia, and although there's some programs, is still in its relatively early stages. And like the issue of entrepreneurial development, it's quite fragmented still. A lot of cluster development efforts going on in different agencies and different ministries. We've got to pull those together. It's not that bad what's going on. What's going on is good. We can just make it better. Lack of supplier development programs, which are a great way to help build up new companies. And finally and broadly, the question of crowding out. I think there's the problem is in Saudi Arabia that your government and government-linked companies and multinationals are so big that the question is there room? And are they kind of bidding up and pulling too many of the resources of the country in that direction, which is understandable, and are we leaving enough room for entrepreneurship? So I think as we go forward, I think we have to recognize a couple of critical facts. If the country is going to get where you want it to get, we're going to have to get this piece working. The piece about entrepreneurship and small business development. If this piece doesn't work, all our efforts the old way are never going to make us satisfied, particularly in job generation. So that's point number one. Point number two is there's now a base. 6 years ago, we were much farther behind than we are today in terms of having some of the pieces in place. But I think it's time to now reevaluate and recalibrate and reintegrate the strategy in this area. Fortunately, we have a lot of people in this room who are working on that. We have allies and friends from around the world working on that, and I'm confident that we can succeed. But ultimately, we can't take our eye off this ball. This is the ball that's going to hopefully allow us to win the World Cup of economic development. But we've got to view this as important, not as a little issue on the side. Thank you for your attention this morning. I'll be most happy to answer any questions.